Hello, everyone. This is Seth Seward. I'm Assistant Director of Alumni Groups. I'm here for another wonderful webinar that we'll be having today. Here we have Kierra Williams of Class 2011. She's Director of Intelligent Management, Organization Development, Global Operations, and Technology at the Goodyear and Tire Rubber Company. And she's also a board member of our College of Arts and Science Alumni Board. She's going to do an excellent presentation here on personal branding. So, Kierra Williams, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks so much, Seth. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining in the world. It's so wonderful to be here with you today to talk about personal branding. I'm always especially honored and privileged to come back to my alma mater in any capacity. So really happy to have you all with us today. And today we are going to talk about personal branding. And personal branding is a topic that you really can go deep into, and you could spend hours, maybe even multiple days in a workshop to talk about personal branding. So just kind of to level set on expectations for the webinar today, we will be talking about personal branding. We'll also be talking about what's the difference between having a personal brand and having a strong personal brand. And how do you use your intangible strengths to create a personal brand that is unique to you and separates you from others, both in the market, whether that's for your jobs, in your organizations, philanthropies that you're a part of. And then we'll leave some time for questions at the end. Just as a quick introduction, so for myself, I am Kierra Williams. As Seth had mentioned earlier, did go to and graduate from Miami. Since graduating with a psychology degree and a bachelor's in psychology with a minor in Black World Studies, I've been really fortunate to partner with a number of different brands in the HR capacity, really spending most of my time in the talent management and organizational effectiveness area. So when we talk about personal branding, this is an area that's pretty big in talent management. When you're thinking about owning your own career, you're thinking about what's next for you, having a really strong personal brand will be very important for you. We know that we live in a VUCA world. There's a lot of uncertainty. If we're paying attention to the news, we see the Great Resignation is very real. A global pandemic that we've all experienced collectively has a lot of individuals thinking about shifting their career, and making major shifts in their career. And so as you make those shifts, you might be someone who's in the middle of that kind of transition, thinking about your personal brand, really thinking about how you are unique in this global market could be something really helpful for you all. So as we dig into today's session, I wanted to just start off with a slide that just to share with you all. These are words that over the last 15 years have been repeat offenders, we'll call them, right? These are words that have shown up in multiple performance reviews at multiple companies. Words like courageous leader, servant leader, empathetic leader, resilient, fearless has probably been the one that has shown up the most on my performance reviews. And you might be asking, why are you sharing this with me, Kierra? Why is this important? And it's important because when we think about later on in the session, we're going to go through how are we defining personal brand. When we think about the things that are common themes that show up, whether it's in a performance review, whether it's in how someone introduces you, whether it's in how someone remembers you. I most recently actually, and the larger community, lost a mentor in the last week. And it's been incredibly heavy on our hearts that we would lose this mentor. But one of the things that has been really uplifting about remembering who he was is all of the LinkedIn posts that people have been sharing that have his isms or kind of some of the words of wisdom that he would share. But one of the things that has really stuck out to me are there are these common threads in how people are talking about how he made them feel, how he made them feel empowered, how he made them feel like they could do anything, how he cared about you as a human being. And we talk about personal brand, and we talk about how people will remember you. That's how you know whether or not you have a strong personal brand, is if you have several people, most of them who have never met, who can say similar things about you. You know you're doing something right. So as I share these words, I shared them because they were not always words that one might use to describe myself or my leadership. And so I'm going to walk you through just a couple of bits and pieces of my own life and kind of this journey that I am still on and constantly on to evolve my own personal brand. And I wanted to start with just a quick story about how I became and how I positioned myself and pivoted from being what I would call an accidental advocate into a fearless leader. And I do joke with individuals often about how I became an accidental advocate. I became an advocate at the age of 14 while I was still in foster care. And I had been in and out of foster care from about the age of 3 until I emancipated at 18. But as I was in and out of foster care in different homes, interacting with different caseworkers, I started to observe inequities in how foster children were treated compared to their peers. There are the obvious comparisons that you make with your family not looking the same as others, but there are also things like lack of privacy. And I remember a defining moment in my advocacy, and where it began was a caseworker coming to my school and announcing to my class that she was my caseworker. And at that time, many of my friends actually didn't know that I was in foster care. And while there shouldn't be a ton of shame associated with that, I was a 14-year-old really striving for normalcy. So for me, it left a really big, memorable blimp for me in my experience as a high school student. But what I remembered most was that I felt like I had a right to privacy, right? And while there should be no shame associated with being a foster child, that foster children still deserve a right to privacy, right? A right to share those most intimate details about their lives. And so I became an advocate again at the age of 14, writing letters to the county, and caught the attention of the director of Ohio Job and Family Services, who had worked with Montgomery County, where I was living, to create this special task force of foster youth who would be involved in advocating for other foster youth and working on policies, trainings, procedures, whether it was with the caseworkers themselves or either foster parents or those who were interested in being foster parents. And so the idea behind this task force, what would be called Vision Youth Advisory Board, was if you are making decisions about foster youth and they will impact them and will impact the trajectory of their life, they should be involved in those decisions, but they should also be involved in informing some of the policies and procedures and have a say in how they are able to interact with those parties. And so as a 14-year-old, I was quickly thrust into a world of advocacy, testifying before Congress at the age of 15 for the first time, writing my first bill when I was 16 and having it signed when I was 17. And during that time, I would say that the words that fearless probably was there, resilient was there, but they were still kind of just happening, right? I was still very much working off of a few things that we'll talk about on the next slide, which is pure emotion and raw talent. There was something intangible in me that saw an injustice and wanted to correct it, wanted to advocate for others, but it was very much untapped potential. It was very unrefined. I was very unaware of what my true strengths and power were. And it was very reactive, right? You see something wrong, you act on it, right? And something that I still talk about, and again, something that as human beings is very normal for us to experience emotion, is that when you are running off of pure emotion, you're easily manipulated, right? You can be easily pulled into different directions to serve other agendas if you're not careful. And that's really where I was at the age of 14 until about 21. I was probably on the road every other week, whether it was traveling to a conference or traveling to testify or lobby at the nation's capital, but constantly being pulled into different directions that gave me a lot of experience, gave me a lot of perspective. It really shifted my perspective through those experiences, but I was not really in the driver's seat of my life, right? I was constantly being pulled in to tell my story, right? Which my story itself over the years was also evolving, right? And part of my story was going from that victim, right, to really taking the power back in my life and really becoming aware that I was creating the life that I wanted to live, and I wasn't a victim and there wasn't a persecutor, right? But that I wanted to be empowered and empower others. And in order for me to shift from that victim mentality to being empowered, I needed to do a few things. Okay. I needed to be very aware of what those strengths were. I needed to be very much in the driver's seat of choosing. What are those laws that I want to participate in and inform policy on, right? What are those speaking engagements that I want to participate in because I believe in what the purpose of that organization is and what they're doing, okay? And in order to do that, there's some work that I had to do in figuring out what those strengths were, figuring out how to create those strong boundaries where I got to have a say in what I wanted to share, what I didn't want to share with the world, what access I gave to others, right? And I also had to think about how am I going to show up and intentionally leverage those strengths, right? So instead of being this uncontained ball of fire, right? How do I intentionally use those strengths, use the fact that I am a challenger, that I am someone who can use that voice that I have to advocate for others, but in a very intentional way? It also meant that I had to understand what my emotions were and understand what triggers those emotions so that I was managing my emotions and not being controlled by them, which gives you the clarity to be able to step back and make those intentional decisions that we were talking about earlier. So what I'm talking about is this journey of shifting from raw talent, those intangibles, those things that you really can't see physically, but that someone has. It's that determination, it's that resiliency, it's that grit. Shifting from that raw talent to really creating a strong personal brand intentionally, and what work it takes to do that, we'll talk about. So when we talk about personal brand, and this is I'll call a buzzword, right? We hear the term personal brand a lot. In the digital age and the social media age, you see personal brand it's on everything. Everyone, there's now a job title called an influencer, right? And your ability to make money and monetize that very much relies on you having a strong personal brand. But in the business world and in leadership, in any organization that you're in, it also requires you to have a strong personal brand for a couple of other reasons. The competitive advantage that you have when you have a strong personal brand really helps to separate you from the competition. And with the Great Resignation happening, while there are a lot of companies that are trying to retain talent and to attract talent, that also means that you have a lot of candidates in the marketplace that are also going for those roles that are open, right? So open roles at companies also means that there are more who are not working that are also vying for those same roles, right? And having that strong personal brand is going to help set you apart as a candidate. And also internally, if you aren't looking for a new role, but you may be inside that organization thinking about how to grow your career, this is also going to help set you apart in terms of talent and differentiate you from your peers and enable you to accelerate your own readiness in taking on those key leadership roles if that is something that you aspire to do. And there are many different definitions for what a personal brand is, but this is how I define personal brand. Our personal brand, you might hear people say it's how you look, right? And certainly that does have, that comes into play. But when I think about personal brand, I really think about it being how others experience you. Your personal brand is how you make people think, sometimes what you make people think about when they've interacted with you, how you make them feel, right? Maya Angelou has a popular quote that people may forget what you do, okay, but they will never forget how you make them feel. And it's also about what you inspire others to do. What inspired action do people take after you've left them with thinking new ideas and making them feel empowered and inspired? And now, what action are you inspiring them to take? And that is, you'll notice that I didn't say anything about what you look like and what you sound like, but that definitely comes into play because all of those factors factor into how you make people think, how you make them feel, and the inspired action that they take after they've interacted with you. And if personal brand is how others experience you, there are a couple of questions that we should be asking ourselves when we're thinking about how to create that strong personal brand. And this is where we're talking about what I mentioned earlier, which is knowing what your strengths and natural talents are. What are those unique intangibles? Again, intangibles are not things that you can necessarily see always on a piece of paper. You can't always see in how someone dresses what those intangibles are. And there are many different ways for you to figure out what your strengths or natural talents are. I encourage and take this time myself, even as you're learning new things. Sometimes you have natural talents that are untapped, but there are also things like leadership assessments that you can take. There are psychometric assessments that help you figure out kind of your internal behaviors and motivations and triggers. That could be one way of figuring out what those strengths or natural talents are. 360s or interviews with others and people who interact with you is also a really great way to see what your strengths and natural talents are. It's also a really great way for you to see how aligned the natural strengths that you feel you bring to the table that you do know of are showing up for others and how they experience you. And it's also a good opportunity to see where you might have blind spots. And blind spots usually has a negative connotation, but you can also have positive blind spots. You could also have raw talent, unique strengths that you are using that are impacting how others experience you that you may not always be as aware of or conscious of. And so figuring out how to ask others and seek that information from them on how they're experiencing you is a helpful way in figuring out what those strengths are. You also want to sit down with yourself and really think about our experiences shape our perspective. And one of the wonderful things about perspective is that we each have our own unique story and perspective and experiences that when we sit with ourselves to really understand what those experiences are and how they've shaped our perspective, what impact did it have on us? Is it impacting how we make decisions? Is it impacting how we show up and what we share with others? Is it impacting what we don't share with others? Could it be impacting the relationships that you seek out or the relationships that you nurture? Or on the other hand, the relationships that you try to avoid? But all in all, our experiences very much have an impact on the way that we think, the way that we act. When we're looking at our strengths and natural talents, the key is asking ourselves, how can you intentionally use those strengths and how you show up in the world? A little intention goes a long way. Anyone who's been in any session of mine hears me say that. My teammates hear me say that probably on a daily basis. But a little intention does go a long way. A little intention in how we use our strengths is the difference between someone maybe negatively perceiving an overuse of a strength, or the intentional, what we call in Strengthsfinder, staying in the balcony of your strength, right? The intentional use of strengths, really allowing others to experience you in the positive light that you intend to be seen in and show up. But that intention is important, right? And so when we think about creating a strong personal brand, as you can see, it's about asking yourself a lot of questions, really sitting with yourself and having that deep introspection, and asking yourself, we'll go back to the slide. Asking yourself, how do you want to show up in the world, and are your actions aligned with you there? The next piece, I think, is incredibly important, especially in the age of always being on. As a global director, I'm constantly on. I have teammates that sit in every part of the world, and that usually means there's a lot of flex time on jumping on calls, whether it's at 5 a.m. my time, sometimes 11 p.m. my time. There's the social media aspect of information now constantly being at the tip of your fingers every single day. And so because we're always on, it can be really hard for us to gauge where our energy is, and what's giving us energy and inspiring us, and what may also be draining that energy, and where we may be spending too much time in other places that may be draining us, and also taking up that headspace from other areas that could give us energy that we are passionate about. And so that alone time, when you're creating a strong personal brand, which, spoiler alert, you're constantly creating it, it's constantly evolving, it really does require you to sit with yourself and your thoughts and really quiet your mind so that you do know what's giving you energy, what's inspiring you, what are those things you're most passionate about, and why. It's also a good thing for us to think about, again, if we're thinking about your personal brand being how people experience you, how you make them think, feel, and what you inspire them to do, what do you want people to think after they've interacted with you? And this can be a tricky one here. So again, a lot of times when we hear things about branding, it's very much optically about what people see or what people hear, in terms of the words that you're saying. But we should also be thinking about content, right? What do you want people to think about? Not just in, hey, I want someone to think I'm a fabulous dresser, right? You may want someone to think you have a fabulous wardrobe and that you are put together, right? And that you are polished, sure. But people with really strong personal brands go a bit further and deeper. They're not just thinking about those optics, right? And what people see at a very superficial level. It's also about the ideas that you have. What are the ideas that you want to share, right? What do you want people to think after they've interacted with you, whether it's about a position, a certain position on a policy, a certain position on gender equality or equity, right? Really asking yourself about that and being intentional about what do you want people to think after they've interacted with you and experienced you. And then again, asking yourself, how do you want people to feel about you and that interaction? And then we've already mentioned this, but what action do you want people to take after they've interacted with you? Now, these are very simple questions. These are very simple questions that you might be looking at and thinking like, yeah, this makes sense, right? If our personal brand is how people experience us, then I should be thinking about these. Here's the trick. Really taking that time to actually sit with yourself and ask these questions. And I can't see any of you in the audience right now, but I'll just pause and give you a few seconds to actually reflect on how often before an interaction that you have with someone, whether it's a meeting, whether it's a new meeting with someone else that you've never met, how many times do you actually sit and think about and reflect on questions like this before that interaction? Now think about what are sometimes the barriers that one might face in being able to have that time. Because I do hear that often. Kierra, Sounds great. It would sound amazing if I could stop multiple times throughout the day to quiet my mind, to have these moments of introspection, but I'm back to back in meetings every single day. My calendar runs my life. I have so many different things going on. Where does one find the time? That's where that intention comes in, right? I had a conversation once with my mentor, and it is something that I continuously pass on to members of my own team and then to myself when I need to hear it. It's those times where you know that you are not intentionally showing up in the world as your best self, where you are busy, where you are back to back, where your calendar is slammed. It's those times where you feel like you just need to keep grinding harder and that you'll see the light on the other end. It is in those exact moments when you must pause, where you must take an opportunity to really zoom out and ask yourself these questions and be very intentional, whether it's about scheduling that time on your calendar, setting those boundaries. And we'll go to the next slide. This is a good segue into, in order for us to show up strong and create that strong personal brand in service of that, you would need to be thinking about how you need to present yourself and how you need to communicate. But you can't ask yourself these questions if you don't create the time and space, right? This is the difference between showing up with those raw talents that each and every one of us has inside of us and really showing up intentionally and using those talents, right? Creating that space and time is a game changer. Many strong leaders and advocates will tell you, and coaches will tell you, that it is often one of the big fails, right, in high potentials and talent that has an incredible amount of knowledge and expertise and just raw talent, is that they often are not taking the time to really sit and reflect on how they're using them. I myself have times still where I think I might be overusing this strength. I'm not necessarily intentionally using this, right? And something lately that we hear often is, stand in your power, stand in your truth, right? And also be cognizant of how you show up. There's a balance, right? So you should know those, and you should be very intentional with how you're showing up, but it does require you to hold space for yourself. Self-care is another term that we hear often in today's world. It's, self-care is, yes, sometimes it's going to the spa. Yes, it's drinking your water and eating your veggies. It's also creating that space in your life and creating those really healthy boundaries with others about where you want to spend your time, right? Calendar blocking is something that I use in the corporate world as a best practice, because you often are living by your Outlook computer and calendar. So if you know that is a system that you're in, blocking off the time to sit down and prepare yourself for meetings intentionally, again, is a game changer in terms of just showing up with that raw talent and really intentionally showing up with a strong brand. So if this were in person, we would be passing out worksheets, but instead we are going to ask you all to just reflect, and we'll drop a link to a PDF after today's session to that personal brand worksheet. But I do want you all to just take a couple of seconds to really write down and reflect on how do you want people to experience you? What do you want your brand to be? What are the things right now that you want people to be thinking about when they interact with you? How do you want people to feel? And more importantly, what's that inspired action that you want people to take? Okay. The Think, Feel, Do framework is something that I've used for a really long time. It's actually something used often in marketing. Why are we talking about that in terms of personal brand? A Think, Feel, Do, a marketing framework? Well, the truth is, you are your chief executive officer of you. You're the chief marketing officer of you. right? And so how you market yourself and how you show up is very much on you, and the ownership is on you. And so thinking about intentionally showing up is on you, right? And the ownership there is on you. And that's a great framework for you to use to assist you along the way. So we will be sending out that worksheet. I think we wanted this to be a bit more interactive too than the session that was live. So we actually will be pausing now to just open the floor we have about 30 minutes to have an interactive discussion. I think Seth is going to jump back on, and we have some questions that were already received. I think that's really where the value in these sessions come from. Is being able to answer some of those questions. So Seth, I think the link is there, and that we have some that were already sent.
Yes. So let me start off with this one off the bat, since we're having graduation this Saturday of a new class of alumni. What are some key words of advice for them as they are, a lot of them are navigating the corporate world or just other industries? Like, what are some key things for them specifically for that generation to, or even our younger alumni, to build their personal brand?
Yeah, so one, congratulations to all of the Red Hawks that are graduating this weekend. It's such a bittersweet moment, I know. And so, great question. What's the biggest piece of advice that I would give them? One, recognize that creating a strong personal brand, it takes that intention every single day, but it also takes time. And early in your career, and really throughout your career, whenever you go through a major change, you are constantly evolving that personal brand. And so just know that starting off with intention is good, right? Being open to shifting that and evolving it as you go is important as well, right? And so I think sometimes it feels counterintuitive for seniors who now have spent, you are in learner mode for 4 years, right? You've spent 4, 5, 6, however long it's taken you. You're in learner mode, right? And you oftentimes put this pressure, and I know I did the same, of when you graduate, now I need to show that immediate value to the company, right? I need to take all of these things that I've learned, and I need to figure out the quickest way to make an impact on that organization. And that is true. And you're also going to stay in learner mode, hopefully for the rest of your life, right? So I think one of the biggest misconceptions with recent grads is that they think, well, the learning is done, now it's time to do, right? The learning never stops. The learning is continuous. It's constantly going to be a part of, hopefully, that learning agility, a part of your toolkit. And so don't put too much pressure on yourself to produce. Certainly organizations want talent that has the desire to learn, to grow, to add value, right? But they also want learners who are also going to be open to learning a new culture, a new organization, learning a new business, right? So don't put too much pressure on yourself, and constantly keep an open growth mindset is my best advice that I could give a recent grad.
Okay. So this question that did come into our registrations, and this might be more of like a business brand type question. It says, is incorporate a command or a suggestion? Is it foolish to resist incorporating a trade name?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would say it depends. I think it really depends on your why, right? If you feel very passionate about monetizing elements of your brand, and you want to build a business off of certain sayings or certain frameworks or methodologies or strategies that you're creating, certainly incorporating and legitimizing a business is going to be very important, right? But if you are just looking at your brand as being something that is going to be an accelerator for you, an enabler for you of other things, and you may not necessarily feel so passionate about monetizing those things, then no, it's not a command. Maybe it's just a suggestion there. I had started off today's session with reminiscing about a mentor that has recently passed away, and he had certain sayings that everyone remembered, and he had never trademarked them, right? But he had what we call in talent the multiplier effect, even still, right? He did very well in business, but when it came to his leadership, I don't know that he ever incorporated his brand. He gave his talents freely, right? And it created a multiplier effect in enabling and empowering many generations after him, though. So I would say this really depends on what you want to do with that brand. If monetizing it is important, protecting that and that ability to monetize from a legal perspective will be very important. If it's not, then it's a suggestion then. So hopefully that answers that question. Is it foolish to resist incorporating a trade name? I would say that goes with that other answer, right? It would be foolish to resist incorporating if you want to monetize, but certainly not necessary if you don't.
Wonderful. So one more of our a little bit older alumni. So what would you give them to like kind of build the confidence to kind of examine what their strengths are, and like what advice would you give for them to shift and move to use those strengths to build their brand and their company or organization?
So I hear two questions there, maybe. So one, it's what are some things that you can do to just identify what those are, and then how do you build that confidence and kind of moving forward in order to take those strengths and intentionally creating that strong brand and pivoting. Maybe you're at a point in your career where you're pivoting. One, I would say be open to learning new things about yourself, or for someone to hold a mirror up to you, and maybe it's seeing things with a fresh perspective and seeing how other people are experiencing you. And it does take an open mind, whether you do a psychometric assessment or a leadership assessment, and there are several out there, right? Strengthsfinder is a very popular one. Myers-Briggs is another. The Hogan assessment has been increasing in popularity over the last few years. And so regardless, all of those assessments require you to do one thing. And that is assessments, and really any kind of leadership development is kind of like going to the gym, right? You can go to the gym and you can look at all of the equipment, and you're probably not going to make too much progress against your fitness goals, right? But if you go to the gym and you intentionally use the equipment that's there, you're more likely to, right? And so those assessments are they only work if, one, you're very honest in how you answer the questions, right? There's a saying that you can't really fool the assessment, and if you try to, you're only fooling yourself, right? And because those assessments are really about self-discovery and figuring out who you are, it requires honest input to get that output that you want to use. And so having an open mind, having honest responses is necessary, but being willing to then sit with someone, and I recommend getting a coach. So Strengthsfinder, I know there's a list of other Strengthsfinder coaches that you can see who's available to do private consulting, but really sitting with a coach. And the difference between a coach and someone just giving you the feedback on the assessment is the coach is going to ask you a ton of questions because they're going to enable you and empower you to get to the answer yourself, right? The assessment will give you a bunch of information. How you question that, how you reflect on that, and spend that time is going to be the difference between it being valuable for you or just being another assessment that you put on the shelf. So that's the first piece, is how do you go about that? Strengthsfinder is a really great assessment in terms of finding those innate strengths that you have. It's probably one of the assessments that is tried and true and has been around a lot longer and still maintains its value because of the foundational principle of really focusing on using your strengths more than weakness fixing, right? And you'll notice in the presentation, I didn't necessarily say anything about developing those gaps. We certainly all have them, but the pursuit of excellence and creating a strong brand is not just about weakness fixing. Okay, it really is about what are those things that naturally give you energy, that naturally light up, that you light up when you hear about them, right? And so Strengthsfinder is a great assessment, though there are other tools out there. Finding the one, I think, that the common language resonates with you the most and that you can understand easily would be my recommendation. The second part of that question was, how do you find the confidence to put yourself out there? And it's a good question, and it's an interesting one, because confidence is built in doubt. And so if you don't feel the doubt, and if you don't feel that pressure, and figure out a way to overcome it, you kind of never built that confidence. And confidence isn't something that one day you have it and one day you don't, but it is something that you can learn, behaviors that help others perceive you in a more confident way. And I say it's just about putting yourself out there continuously and having that reflection to see where you're learning and learn from those mistakes, see where you maybe have some failure points. Maybe you're not as confident. Someone gives you that feedback, which also then goes back to the first part of the question. I think having that learner mindset, that growth mindset, being willing to hear something about yourself that maybe you hadn't heard before, and really sitting with that and thinking about what adjustments do I need to make. So confidence is built in doubt, and you have to allow yourself to go through those seasons of doubt, and just believe that there's something on the other side, and put that action into getting on the other side. And then it's a rinse and repeat cycle. I would say at work, if you've been there for a long time, ask your talent management partner, if you have one, or a leader that you trust, hey, I know I may even have been in this position for a long time. And as you all are assessing talent and you're assessing the potential of the organization, you may think that I don't have the aspirations because maybe in the past I didn't. But I'm inspired now and want to move into other spaces that grow and develop my experiences and capabilities. And I would like to be considered for this position, right? I think as we think about how talent management and how career development and career acceleration has shifted over the last 15 years, we're really starting to see that because it's such a competitive market globally, right? People are now, a lot of roles, especially being remote, you're not just competing with that talent that's in your hometown or where that company is located. You're really competing with a global market. And that does mean that your own behaviors and how you throw your name in the hat for positions, how you network with leaders also has to shift with that environment. And so it's initiating and really taking that initiative to set up those meetings with those leaders to at least start the process of seeing where those strengths are and those opportunities are, and how you need to develop to be ready to move on. Seth, that was a great question. I think there are some other questions that have come in since.
Yeah, so we'll probably have time for two more. And one of them that kind of deals a little bit more with strengths. So what tips do you have to love your strengths and not to downplay them?
That's a great question. One, I think it's sitting with them to understand them, right? But I think understand them in terms of like what's coming natural to you, but also understand the impact of them, right? So when you think about using your strengths, it's not just I'm going to use this strength and hope and spray and pray, right? I'm just going to show up and pray that people will experience them the way that I'm intending. No, really sit down and think about what's the impact that when you intentionally use those strengths that it has on a room, on an individual, on a project, right? And we said this earlier in the session, you are the chief marketer of you and the chief CEO of you, right? So you have to be willing to lead with, here's where I know I add value, and here's how I know that when I intentionally use this strength, the impact that it has. And by the way, here's the impact that it's had in the past on my ability to deliver, to drive projects forward. Here's how I know it can be used in the future and have that confidence, right? it's a very popular saying, Marion, I think Nelson Mandela became famous for it, but I think it was Marion Williamson's quote on, no one, playing small doesn't serve others, essentially, right? So by playing small, you're not helping yourself. You're also not helping anyone else around you, right? In fact, you could be hurting others because there could be on a team a need for your strength, right? Your team could have a deficiency in that area. And there is a way to self-promote in a way that's not just self-serving, but serves the greater needs of the team. Having that confidence and having that awareness of the impact, I think, is the key to getting there.
Wonderful. So let's just shift a little bit to a different focus here, but we'll just go ahead and ask here. So any advice for developing a personal brand that helps others experience you the way that you want in a male-dominated industry? Sometimes it feels like I need to project a persona that isn't always authentic to a desired result. That's a wonderful question.
That's such a great question. For the last 5 years, I've worked in supporting operations and technology teams, which is a very male-dominated space today. There's certainly a lot of work that's being done to accelerate, talent and female voices and elevate and ready that talent to provide some equity. But the inequity still exists. So you said something in the second part of your question that I think is really important. And so there are two parts. One, how do you shift how you're showing up and be intentional about showing up in a way that is authentic and ultimately doesn't betray who you are, right? Because if you are someone, and I'll just throw this out here because this is a gender bias, a double bind, we call it, that shows up often with female leaders, is that, sometimes you have the double bind of if you are not as loud or commanding, you are seen as being timid and not having a point of view. And if you are someone like me who's very assertive and can command a room and has no problem using their voice, you could also be seen as too aggressive, right? And you're constantly trying to, and I know I've experienced this myself, balance, being authentic, but also balancing how others perceive you. And something that we tell our children, and that maybe we were told, is that, it doesn't matter what anyone thinks of you. And what others think of you should not shift your own value and how you think about yourself and the self-compassion and love that you have for yourself. But in business and in organizations, perception does matter, and how people perceive you can be the difference in having that opportunity to create that value and to go after those roles. It's just a fact that human beings still very much are flawed sometimes in how we make decisions. And so those biases, they're always going to be present. You will never eliminate those. That's both the negative bias and the positive bias, right? And so knowing how you need to show up while being authentic, but also getting that desired result, I think goes back to really understanding what is the result that you want to get. So rather than consuming yourself with, I need to be more assertive, or I need to speak louder in a room. And sometimes you do, right? Sometimes it's just, you need people to hear your voice, and how do you practice that? And if that's going to maybe deplete your energy, do you know how to self-regulate and get that energy back? But sometimes it's not always that. Sometimes it's just, do you really understand what that team wants to achieve? Really understanding what's the outcome that this team really wants, because how you get there can shift. Right? If the outcome is that, they want new ideas to be heard and they want to drive innovation within a company, being loud might help with that, but not really, right? Maybe the loudest person is always the one that gets their ideas out there, but you could also think about, what are your strengths? If your strengths are, hey, I do really well in one-on-one situations with leaders, and I have that ability to connect on a one-on-one level, how can you use that strength to your advantage? you could set up meetings with someone before just pitching in the room and really get their feedback and their thoughts, and use that ability to connect with others on an individual level, so that when you get into that room, you've built also the confidence in that team and how they're thinking about your ideas and receiving them, to sometimes be able to maybe assert yourself a little bit more, right? But I think ultimately, you should also ask yourself too, being a trailblazer does mean sometimes that you will be the person that might face certain experiences where there are the cuts and bruises that come along with being a trailblazer. I think sitting with yourself internally and thinking about, if I know that in order to show up differently, that I might need to go against the grain and others may perceive me differently, I think the question to ask yourself is, are you being effective? Does it matter if they perceive you differently, but you are still getting results and you're effective and you really know what that outcome is, and you are constantly thinking about how to shift and position yourself towards that outcome? Ultimately, that's what's most important, right? Hopefully I was able to answer that question. Feel free to drop a follow-up question into that. I'll just finish on that too with, you have a lot of power right now in the marketplace. And I think now more than ever, we do have companies that are looking at their internal culture and saying, the workforce looks a lot different than when this company started. And there's a lot of systems thinking happening where you have organizations saying, hey, the structural norms that we have, the structural processes that we have don't work for us anymore, because they were created to serve a certain demographic that now is 30% of our workforce, right? So also you have a lot of power in aligning yourself with companies that allow you to bring your full self to work, right? And then if you are somewhere where they're still in that transition or that shift in their culture, ask yourself if you are willing to be that person who is able to and determined to show up authentically as themselves, and lead differently and maybe speak differently, have a different way of sharing your ideas, right? And stand confident in that how you show up and the strengths and the value and the impact that you have on a team matters, even if it's different from everyone else's. That's a great question.
She said, great feedback. Thank you. So that answered the question. Okay. So is that the same? Did you, and as far as a racial or ethnic perspective with the biases that come, working in big corporations or wherever, is that the same answer you would give from that perspective, from a racial perspective?
Yeah. And so, there are certain, being a woman of color, I'm African American and Indigenous, and I've been a part of several companies where you might see it, maybe not in as blatant, right? And people feeling as though people are blatantly discriminating against you. I think what we see is it's the representation in leadership, right? It might be you recognize what an organization cares about by what they reinforce, what they reward, and what they promote. Whether that's in who gets the job, whether that's in who is paid the highest, right? Whose voice is elevated at the table. And I would say it's very similar, right? Regardless of whether it's those cultural norms that may be different based on gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. I would say the advice is the same. Know yourself and know what value you bring. And sometimes that means knowing how to navigate within that organization. You might be at an organization and you say, what they are doing really matters to me. Their why and their purpose really matters to me. And I'm passionate about this work, right? And at the same time, I feel very conflicted because what I see in terms of representation and what they promote and what they reinforce and what they reward, I see maybe that there's not many people who look like me or sound like me or where I'm from that get that attention. You have to ask yourself, one, where can you be that change, and where can you create those relationships and be that person that can be a trailblazer? Or two, really think about what's important for you. Is it important for you to be at a company or organization where you're really aligned to their purpose and their mission? Or is it really important for you that that representation be there, that the diversity of thought and perspectives is something that is celebrated? And sometimes in your career, you have to make tough decisions about which one's more important for you. And how much are you willing to be a part of that change, or how much are you willing to say, you know what? I really value what I bring to an organization, and if I can't bring my full self, I'm not bringing all of that value. How do I align myself with a company that is showing in how they reinforce, reward, and recognize and promote that that's also important to them? You have to make those tough decisions sometimes to walk away and align yourself to a company that has those things. What I'll say to that is that there's no company that is getting it 100% and perfectly right. And so there's always going to be that balance and that trade-off that you've got to think about, and what you're willing to trade off, and what's table stakes for you. What are those things that are absolutely things that you cannot bend on for your own personal self and value? Because ultimately you're the one that's living with that decision, right, every day.
And just briefly, just speak to Miamians. Speak to the experience and education that you have as motivation for them in their careers. So, a little bit of the last word from there, from that perspective.
That is a very big, broad ask. One thing that I will say to the Miami alumni on the call, and again, I've worked for global companies that, while I live in Ohio now, that have a global presence, and even when I was on the West Coast, right, even when I was working at a large company on the West Coast, there were a lot of Miamians that I was working with. And so Miami has a very strong brand value associated with it. And I cannot stress enough how important it is to stay active and engaged with the alumni associations. Read the Miamian, see what other alumni are doing, see what's going on the campus now, and keep those Miami connections alive, because and it's not just that we all connect over probably having the most beautiful campus in the country, maybe even the world. I think we're all biased. We think that. But Miami also did something about 15 years, maybe even 20. They did something in terms of how they looked at their curriculum and decided to take that inquiry-based approach to learning that not every university was on and liberal arts school was ready to adopt. And so that inquiry-based learning was, we're going to shift how we teach things and how we teach our students. It's not just going to be lecture and a bunch of information. It's really going to be about teaching students to be curious, teaching them to sit with concepts and to come with a point of view, and valuing that discussion and how they look at the world. I can't stress enough how important curiosity and that learning agility, the ability to sit down and think about concepts, methodologies, frameworks, and have conversations around them. That earlier question around confidence, confidence is built in doubt, but there's a doubt, when you hear new information, do I understand it? Do I know how to use this? Do I believe really in this? And sharing those perspectives with other people, and challenging each other in the way that we think is also a way of building confidence, not just in what we know, but how we problem solve, how we figure them out. And so I think employers still very much see Miami as a top employer. We have a lot of alumni who go on to be CEOs and COOs, and it's not just because they went to Miami. It's also because of how they learned while they were at Miami. So feel free to sport that Miami hoodie and hat. People see that and they notice, right? And so I would say definitely let people know that you went to Miami. Have conversations where you share what your experience was like, but lean into that curiosity. That is something that you had to practice as a Miami student that will continue to serve you well in your career, because the world is constantly changing. There's a lot of uncertainty in the market, right? And so it requires people to be curious about, one, what is that uncertainty? What is the volatility that's impacting all of us right now? Where are those things, those big, hairy, ambiguous problems that need to be solved? And then thinking about, how can I add value in solving those, right? I think that's a really important skill set for all of us to lean into, that we kind of get a head start with going to Miami.
Wonderful. That was music to my ears. It inspired me as well.
I was not paid to say those things.
It inspired me as well as I move along in my career too. So we thank you, Kierra, for taking your time out of your day to really give us some impactful things to move on. She did mention that it's a worksheet that she created for folks. So we will email that to you at the conclusion of this webinar. I would also love to tell you that we do have a lot of content that's very good that you can take a look at and watch as well from previous recordings, and you can watch any upcoming recordings as well, webinars as well. And we just thank you for tuning in today. And with all that said, love and honor.
Love and honor. Thanks for joining, everyone. Have a fantastic rest of your week. Thanks, Seth.